we're going to spend the next hour with our good friend Tom Donilon, who doesn't need any introduction and is not going to get one, other than to say, you're all aware he spent 5 years in the administration, and most of those years as the National Security Advisor. What we're going to do is, I'm going to start by talking about, or asking him about the rebalance to Asia. I'm going to try to stay at a strategic level and resist and fail at resisting talking about certain issues that are hot right at the moment. But we're going to go back and forth between the strategic and the immediate. And so what I'd like to do is ask you first to just take us through, in your own words, what the rebalance actually is, so that it's clear to people, because this thing does get a little bit of kind of lack of clarity from time to time.
Thanks, John. Is that all right? Does it sound great? Okay. Thanks for having me here today. It's good to be back as a lapsed member of the Brookings Board of Trustees. I'm happy to be here and in your embrace again today. And I hope Strobe does well in his medical issue. We all wish him well, I know. So with respect to the rebalance, as most of you know here, this was a passion of mine in the course of the Obama administration. And it was the right strategy in 2008 when we designed it, and it's the right strategy today. It has its roots in a number of things. One is a reflection of and a recognition of the role that the United States has played in Asia for the last over 6 decades, as really putting together the platform on which the extraordinary social and economic development of Asia has been built. And do a thought experiment and think about where Asia would be in terms of rivalry versus prosperity, and you can do all the comparisons, where it would be absent the United States' presence in Asia for the last 6 decades. And I think that thought experiment really does underscore the importance of the U.S. presence there. Secondly, of course, was a recognition that the United States' future, our prosperity and security going forward, and Asia's are interlinked, and increasingly so into the 21st century. We, at the outset of the Obama administration, during the course of the transition, undertook a complete review, obviously, of foreign policy. And we asked ourselves the kind of question that a lot of you here would ask in business, which is, where are we overinvested and where are we underinvested? Do we have the right footprint, the right allocation of assets, if you will, in terms of the U.S. assets in the world? And we came to the conclusion that we were way overinvested, frankly, in terms of military activities and assets in the Middle East, and we were substantially underinvested across all dimensions of American power, including things like mind share and presidential presence and things like this, in Asia. And so we undertook to rebalance that. Now, there's been some people call it pivot, some people call it rebalance. I've been giving the presentation of this from the time of the transition into early 2009. I really would call it a rebalance. A pivot's too sharp, frankly. The speechwriters like pivot because that's a strong word. Rebalance is too complicated. But the policy is a rebalance, which is a kind of a reallocation of resources. It doesn't imply that the United States, as a global power, is turning away, if you will, from its responsibilities in other areas of the world. And of course we can't, and we can see that in the world today. The strategy itself, John, was multidimensional. And it included at least the following half a dozen things. One is a real focus on alliances as the key to our presence and future in Asia, and to revitalize and renew those alliances, which, by the way, had been frayed. The period, this is not a partisan comment, I think it's a fair thing to say, is that the period leading up to January 2009 was an exhausting period in American foreign policy. Tremendous exertion on big projects around the world. It was also in the wake of the financial crisis. And so we had a lot of fraying around our alliances, and we really, I think, dug in deep into renewing those alliances. And I think today, frankly, one of the things we can do today is talk about an assessment about where we are. I think we've made steady progress along all these dimensions, including alliances. I think today our alliances in Asia are in as good a shape as they've ever been. I saw a poll recently which had, and this has not always been the case, as a lot of you know in this room, 84% of the Japanese people support the American alliance. There's a similar number in Korea, for example. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but it's been a lot of attention paid to this. Now, we can talk about some of the issues there, including a real challenge in terms of the relationship between Seoul and Tokyo right now, which is a real challenge for the United States and can undermine a lot of what we're doing here, and it needs to be addressed. The alliances were at the core. Second was establishing relationships with emerging powers in Asia, and essentially imagining those coalitions that we thought, the partnerships we thought we would need to have in the next decade or 2 decades in terms of pursuing our interest in Asia. And that caused us to really dig into deepening the relationship with India, that has its own Asia strategy. Obviously, it's Go East strategy, Indonesia, and other countries. I think we've made substantial progress along those lines, all those lines too. Third was to pay attention to institution building in Asia. Interestingly enough, as you know, it's a region of the world that doesn't have anything like the institutions that we have, for example, in Europe. And those kinds of institutions really wouldn't work in Asia because there's a particular kind of interaction among countries in Asia. But we really focused on trying to build out institutions in Asia. Paid attention to a couple of very important ones. ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, has been a real focus in terms of building out our relationship with them as an institution. Lots of pieces to this, including the fact that the President has met with the leaders of ASEAN every year he's been in office at the head of state or head of government level. And we have, for example, even just next month, Secretary Hagel for the first time is meeting in Hawaii with the ASEAN defense ministers, but building out that as an institution. We also sought to build out the East Asia Summit, which has been an organization that kind of been rolling along without a lot of purpose. We determined that the President would participate at the head of state level on a yearly basis there. Why? To try to give it a focus and to do what we can do to make it the premier institution in Asia for security and diplomatic discussions. And it's had a real impact, particularly in the South China Sea discussions, where we've been able to multilateralize that discussion with the Chinese. So institution building. Fourth has been to build out, on the political side, an economic architecture for the future. And obviously the focal point there has been the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP negotiation, which has been a big effort by the United States, part of an overall trade strategy that we've had globally. It's the most important trade negotiation going on in the world today. It involves 40% of the world's GDP. I think that there's been a lot of progress made on that. We have some domestic issues here which we can talk about with respect to it. It is a critical economic step for the United States. It is the way in which the United States and its partners will design high quality, high standard rules of the road for economics going into the future. And that's an important, there are others out there who would like to design those rules. And I think having the United States and its partners really at the center of that, building that order, if you will, around trade is very important. It's linked, by the way, strategically to the TTIP and the Atlantic side, but I'll talk about that in a second. But as a strategic matter, this really is an important strategic leadership initiative for the United States. It's a win-win between the United States and the countries of Asia. I said it's positive on the economic side. It is really important on the leadership side for the United States. It really is the center of the economic element of the rebalance to Asia. And the fifth piece was a constructive and productive relationship with China. And we put and have put enormous effort into this, as you know. President Obama and President Hu Jintao, the former president of China, met 13 times in 4 years. The president's had 2 meetings already with President Xi, including an important summit, which I negotiated at Sunnylands, California last year. The president, I think, is scheduled to see President Xi at the Hague at the Nuclear Security Summit later this month. But an intensive involvement, obviously, with China in terms of that relationship. That's very important, by the way, because we have dual roles, at least, right? On the one hand, our partners and allies in the region want to see us meet our obligations and provide the reassurance and assurance that's necessary there, particularly in the wake of the rise of China. On the other hand, they expect us to run a constructive and productive relationship with China and not to force unnecessary choices on countries in the region. That's a very important insight. It's made powerfully, by the way. If you haven't seen it, I don't know if he's here or not, but we're listening. Jeff Dyer at the FT's written a book called The Contest of the Century, which I read this past weekend, which really goes into this in some detail. It's a really good book if you were interested in this topic. So those are the key elements. I think we've made steady progress along each of them. There are challenges. The president's going to Asia in April. It's in some ways a makeup trip for the trip he missed last November because of the nonsense in Washington around the shutdown. That was a very, very costly cancellation, frankly. There were 2 summits that were on tap. There was the APEC summit, there was the East Asia summit, where the United States presence makes all the difference. And without the United States there, they're not going to go. It just won't be. Not as productive. The president wasn't able to go. Also, there was also Malaysia and Philippines on that trip, so he'll make that up. the Malaysian-Philippines side of this when he goes in April. He's also going to go to Northeast Asia to visit Korea and Japan, which I think is very important in terms of underscoring, again, kind of the centrality of our alliances in Asia. As I mentioned, in terms of the alliances, we have these really, you have this intersection of history and nationalism, right? And it's and obviously very troublesome right now between Seoul and Tokyo. And I hope the president can obviously address that there. He's also had the opportunity to see both those nations, both the leaders of those nations, President Park and Prime Minister Abe, at The Hague this month, and perhaps maybe we could get them together there to start to make some progress there. I think the United States is going to have to become more deeply involved in trying to pull them together.
So let me ask you, when the rebalancing was first rolled out, and you were at some point chose to or were deputized to go and speak to the Chinese and talk through with them exactly what this meant. Give us a sense of the texture of those conversations, the volume, the quality, the level, so that we could get some insight into the nature of that relationship and how you manage that.
Yeah, I think I probably spent about 30 hours making presentations to the Chinese leadership on the rebalance over the course of 4 years. And it begins where I began here, which is basically a recognition of the historical role that the United States has played, the benefit that that role has been for Asia in terms of social economic development, and perhaps no country has benefited more than China, frankly, from the U.S. presence in Asia. The presentations have to be very clear with respect to our commitments in terms of alliances and our partnerships there. The kinds of goals that we have in terms of the order that we'd like to see in Asia continue. A discussion quite direct with the Chinese about whether this is containment under another guise. My lead point on that, John, typically would be something along these lines. We know what containment looks like, and we are quite familiar with all the aspects of that. And it doesn't resemble a $500 billion a year trade relationship or anything like the relationship that we have with China. And it kind of moves from there. We talk about some of the challenges that we have in terms of our building out a constructive and productive relationship. One that I am increasingly concerned about is the fact that the mill-to-mill relationship, military-to-military relationship between the United States and China is way behind the diplomatic and economic relationship. And it's very, it continues to worry me, frankly. But that's kind of the tone of the conversations. And then move to the point that I made in the presentation, which is that an essential element of our intensification of our effort in Asia is a constructive and productive and intensive relationship with the Chinese government.
And on the Chinese side, the questions they're asking you, these are very direct, in-depth questions, or these are sort of wary?
Quite direct and in-depth. Yeah. Why do you have this military activity in this area? What is your vision of the TPP? Would the TPP ever be open to Chinese participation? It's at that level of that level. We have in my judgment, quite a good in terms of openness, right, and detail and straightforwardness. I think at this point built out a pretty good set of relationships with the Chinese. With the Chinese leadership. Now, they have a lot of challenges right now. We can talk about that, and some of the things at this point are less clear than I would like them to be in terms of the future. But in terms of the mechanisms, I guess is the word I'm looking for, the mechanisms are quite sound right now, I think, in terms of the conversation. And frankly, there really isn't any reason for there to be any questions that go unanswered as between China and the United States about our intentions.
And you spent quite a bit of time with the senior Chinese leadership, current leadership. Give us your impressions of them and also your impression of how they're thinking about us.
Well, with respect to the Chinese leadership, I'd say the following things. Number one is that President Xi has consolidated power quite quickly and quite effectively. And you could see this almost from the beginning of his tenure. He really does operate as very much a first among equals. Doesn't really present himself as as just a member of the team, but rather really operates quite confidently. You see the consolidation in a number of other areas, by the way, more concrete. That's just a personal observation. But the more concrete areas, he assumed the chairmanship of the Central Military Commission right away. It took Hu Jintao 2 years to come to that position, I think. He has brought into his office a very quite impressive group of projects and people, frankly. He's running a number of the key projects and initiatives right out of his office. Right? He's chairing the leading committee on the economic reforms that were announced at the third plenum. Just the other day, he announced that he would be running the cyber effort, their cyber policy effort, right out of his office. So a real consolidation of power around Xi. He has there's a real focus, obviously, on the economy and the economic challenges, as you know. I think, if you go to the old adage that personnel is policy, I think that it speaks to a serious reform effort. As you know, a number of these folks who work with President Xi, including the Premier Li Keqiang and his almost his personal economic aide Liu He. So it's I think a real focus there and a pretty high quality group, frankly, of aides around these issues. I think that we're still discerning, and they may still be working through their overall foreign policy approach. They've had if you look at the dynamic in the region the last 3 or 4 years, in some ways, in many ways, frankly, Chinese conduct has generated increased demand for U.S. leadership in the region. And I think that they're trying to get this balance right. But there are a lot of stakeholders in China who are pushing and pulling with respect to the leadership on how aggressive or not aggressive to be on the foreign policy realm.
So I want to now go into take a slight tangent and then come back.
Yeah.
So we have the situation in the Ukraine.
That's a tangent.
But what I want to come into it though through China just for a second. What I want to know is, I want to know what you think about the whole situation, but I also want to know, in relation to the situation, how do the Chinese and the U.S.-China relationship figure into that, if at all?
Yeah, I think there's a number of kind of competing interests that the Chinese have, or competing principles, and I think that puts before them a number of difficult questions. I think we seem to know where they're coming down. On the one hand, a core principle of Chinese foreign policy has been the non-interference policy, and this has been at the core really of their foreign policy since I've been following it. And this obviously is directly violative of that principle, this being the Russian actions in Crimea and in Ukraine. On the other hand, of course, they have a relationship with Russia where they typically choose to act together. And the third issue that they have, I think, here is that they have a substantial commercial relationship with Ukraine, particularly in the agricultural area, where they obviously do import, but they also have substantial real operations in Ukraine, including farmland somewhere on the acreage of Belgium, right? Given the scale of some of the operations that they have, that the Chinese have in Ukraine. So they have some competing interests here, which is seen out of the Chinese foreign ministry has been I think, basically kind of we're going to abide by our principles answer, which is that we respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine should be respected, and that Russia and the other parties should work this out. So they haven't automatically in any way reflexively said that they would stand with Russia, for example, in resisting critiques of their activity here. And I think that they have kind of tilted toward the non-interference principle, and also tilted towards, not surprisingly, protecting their commercial interests in Ukraine.
Okay, now
you can imagine would be quite damaged if they if they went in a different direction with respect to what the current government is in Ukraine.
Okay, so let's stay with Ukraine just for a second, because you also spent a lot of time with President Putin, so you've got a feel for him personally. What do you make of what is he doing, and where is this going to play out, and how do you think we should think about this?
Well, a couple of things. One is that and I don't know if Steve Pfeiffer or Fiona Hill are here. We've got great scholars here on Russia and Ukraine at Brookings. I mean, really first-class scholars. And Fiona's done a great book on Putin. With respect to Putin, though, my observations are these, John. One is that for him, these concepts of balance of power, spheres of influence, are quite real concepts and quite relevant to how he views the world. Number two, that he has tried to carve out a distinct posture for Russian foreign policy. It's mainly been, though, in contradistinction to or counterpoint to the West and the United States, as opposed to an affirmative policy. He has a long list of grievances and sense of threat from the West. I think with respect to Ukraine, that he regards it as a element of the Russian sphere of influence. There's not a real appreciation or approval of Ukraine or any of the former Soviet republics acting completely independent of, and certainly not contrary to, Russian interests. When the Yanukovych government fell, this is a real blow. It's also related to this kind of fanciful view that I think President Putin has of a Eurasian Union that could be a counterpoint to the European Union. And without Ukraine, even that fanciful perspective goes away. That's not going to happen without Ukraine. But the point is here is that Ukraine is orienting itself to the West, and he saw that and determined after the Olympics, where, by the way, they had spent $50 billion trying to burnish their image in the world, that I think when he got back to Moscow, they saw the what I described here, which is basically a key element of their sphere of influence orienting itself to the West, and he determined that he would do something to regain leverage in the situation, to be able to try to affect the situation, regain leverage, and perhaps destabilize the new interim Ukrainian government. And I think that's what's happened here. This. And by the way, this is consistent. I recall in the summer of 2008, in the wake of the Georgian military incursion by the Russians, President Medvedev gave a talk that was quite well noted at the time, where he expressly talked about the fact that Russia had privileged interests in these former Soviet republics, and that was a direct statement in the fact that they believed that this was a sphere of influence, and I think that's what he has acted on here.
So how do you see this thing playing? What do you think is going to happen? How's it going to play out?
Well, I don't think it's clear, Frank. I think it's actually the Crimea has been a potential flashpoint for a long time. Really from the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Analysts have worried about a potential conflict there. I think that the United States and the West, I think, is on the right track here in terms of kind of looking at a multidimensional policy. I think embracing the interim government in Kiev is important, and Secretary Kerry went there 2 days ago, and other foreign ministers from the West have gone. He convened a number of these leaders in Paris yesterday. So I think a full embrace of the new government there is really important from the West. Indeed, I'd have the next foreign ministers meeting actually in Kiev. Second, a kind of immediate effort to shore up the Ukrainian government financially. And we've seen steps by both the United States promising a $1 billion loan facility, and then the European Union promising $15 billion in the form of loans and grants and some credits over the next 2 years. I think that's pretty important. Third is an effort to try to de-escalate the situation and try to move towards a negotiated solution. And I think the elements are being put out there with respect to monitors in Crimea. The stated reason by President Putin for why they went in there was to protect Russian nationals or Russian speakers or Russian compatriots. And of course, there's been no evidence that anyone has been threatened in Crimea. So it's a total pretext for it. But the real reason, I think, is what I outlined earlier. But that can be addressed through a set of monitors coming in. Prime Minister Lavrov rejected that yesterday, saying he didn't think it would help. But why wouldn't it help to have monitors there to be able to give kind of an objective view as to what was going on there? A recognition of the Russian concerns there, including their concerns about their very large Black Sea fleet base at Sevastopol can be done and move towards elections. So there are elements here of a potential solution if the Russians are interested in it, and Kerry is pursuing that pretty vigorously. In the interim, I do think it's important for us to continue to reinforce our commitments to our NATO allies. And it's important to do the next piece here, which we're doing, which is to basically indicate to President Putin that acting illegally essentially to upend the post-Cold War order, right, of borders and acting consistent with international law, that there's a cost to that, and we've begun to move on a set of sanctions, which I think are important to do. Now, last thing I'll say on that is that there's a lot of commentary that, in fact, that the West and the United States doesn't have any leverage. That's just not true. You can stand defiantly as a political posture, if you're President Putin, aside from the rest of the world, and be isolated, if you will, and take the criticism from the rest of the world with respect to the things that you've done. And he can take that posture. You can't do that with your economy. In a globalized economy, you can't stand over here and unplug, right? And in fact, their economy would be vulnerable, I think, to sanctions. I think that the West has a great deal of leverage, frankly.
Okay, I've got two more questions, then I'm going to open it up to the floor. So you might be thinking about what you want to ask Tom. Talk about how the Ukraine situation and our relationship with the Russians, the impact of that on what we're trying to do in Syria, what we're trying to do in Iran, the rest of the Middle East.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and which is why it would be in everybody's interest, I think, to try to move this towards a diplomatic settlement. And again, it's dangerous every day. When you have Russian troops in Crimea, Ukrainian troops there, Ukrainian national troops there, interacting, it's just fraught with potential for miscalculation and mistake and overreaction. And every day that goes on is a real danger. So it's important. Though a diplomatic solution would obviously be in everybody's interest. With respect to the other projects that we're working on with the Russians, and there are a number of them, and I've spent a lot of time, as you know, with the Russians on each of these projects. We have this in Syria. We're working together. We were working together. We suspended military cooperation in the last couple of days on getting this chemical weapons out of Syria. We've been working actually quite closely together for the last 4 or 5 years on the Iran project, as they're a member of the group of nations that have been negotiating with the Iranians. We've actually had very good cooperation with the Russians, including on sanctions. So these are important projects. In each of those cases, though, John, the Russians have independent interests for pursuing them. The Russians have an independent interest in trying to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. They have quite a bit at stake in terms of the success of this chemical weapons destruction project in Syria, and I think that's how you'd have to kind of address it. But I do think that it's a fair question.
Let me ask you, I said I had two questions. I actually have three. My second one is, you characterized the relationship with the Chinese, and the mechanisms you said were quite healthy and robust.
Except in the mill area.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about the U.S. and the Russians? How?
I think that we have all manner of interaction with the Russians, and I guess I would describe it a couple of ways. One is that from the period of April 2009 until May 2012, which is basically the period when President Obama and President Medvedev were in office together, it was quite constructive. I went to see President Putin on the Friday night before he was inaugurated in May of 2012, and it was clear then that there was going to be a change in approach. And frankly, since then, the Russia-U.S. relationship has, again, we have a number of mechanisms that we work on every day, but at the strategic level, a big project level, it had stalled. And it really has been stalled since then, largely because of the disagreement over Syria. And that's a whole other discussion that we can have, but it's been stalled. So a number of the big things that we were moving to work on, including the next step in arms control, have been really, again, as I said, I think the right word is stalled by our fundamental disagreement over the approach in Syria.
Okay, so my final question is, I want to go back to Asia and ask you to comment about what I'll call the triangle between China, Japan, South Korea, and on the one hand, the complexity with respect to how the Japanese are behaving at the moment in relation to the Koreans and the Chinese, and on the other hand, the Chinese stance towards the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and how in practice the rebalancing is playing out in such delicate, tricky complex topics.
Yeah, well, taking the last part first, I think with respect to the South China Sea, the U.S. Push, if you will. Again, we don't have any claims. Well, we don't take a position on specific claims with respect to the South China Sea I'm talking about now. But we do have a view on how nations should conduct themselves with respect to settling or addressing these claims. And it is against coercion or force or threat, and trying to steer it towards mechanisms under international law. We have, again, we don't have a specific interest in a particular claim, but we have a big interest in freedom of navigation, settling disputes by international law, settling disputes peaceably, and that really is the thrust of our effort there. And you saw the administration actually made some very really kind of direct statements in the last couple of weeks with respect to the South China Sea claims that China has made. Again, as a way to make a statement about the need to have these claims solved consistent with international law and peaceful resolution and freedom of navigation. My presentation to the Chinese on this begin with the presentation on their interest in ultimately as a global, as a country that has to operate globally, interest in freedom of navigation and these principles being in force.
And how about on Japan, Korea, China?
Yeah, I think that this is a the security situation in Northeast Asia right now is quite delicate, and the U.S. plays a role here in terms of its ability to really advise all parties to reduce tensions and to try to look for means of reconciliation. And I think that's an important role for us to play. As I said, with respect to our allies, I think that the President should the United States should play a direct role with respect to trying to seek reconciliation and direct contacts between the leaders of those two countries going forward. We have a lot at stake. This is we have a lot of stake in Asia. We have a lot of stake in Northeast Asia, and our ability to do the things that we are looked to do, which provides security in Northeast Asia, is directly affected by the quantity and quality of the contacts and the quality of the relationship between Korea and Japan.
But in that example, will the Japanese and the Koreans, and for that matter the Chinese, will they accept the basic premise that the United States that we want the United States to engage in these conversations on topics that are so sensitive to them and so?
I think that they would agree with the proposition that the United States should advise all the parties, right, to engage in approaches that don't raise tensions unnecessarily. We also, by the way, are quite clear in these discussions. For example, and again, you've mixed up 2 or 3 of these things there, right? They're different discussions. We've got to be very careful about them. With respect to the alliance discussion, that's an alliance discussion. And as I said, we have an independent interest in seeing better relations between Korea and Japan. Mm-hmm. That directly affect our ability to do the things that we are looked to do mm-hmm. there, which is to provide security in the face of an emergency act. And that trilateral sets of cooperation is really quite important to the United States and our ability to carry this off. With respect to China and Japan, the United States being able, for example, here's a good example. Last November, the Chinese government unilaterally declared an air defense identification zone mm-hmm. that overlapped with the air defense identification zones of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, actually. Mm-hmm. It was important for the United States to act in that situation, and the Chinese saw that this just wasn't a step that affected Japan. I think that's principally where it was aimed, mm-hmm. but they saw that, in fact, it would affect the U.S. interests, and I think that the American statements and position that we took, including, by the way, reminding the region of our alliance relationship and obligation to Japan, was really important, I think, in terms of tempering conduct.
Are you optimistic on these issues getting sort of sorted, or do you feel as though they're going in the wrong direction?
I think it's going to take. I think it'll take leadership in each of the capitals, and we need to find some ways to break the ice, if you will. I think that's important, and I think that's something the United States should be focused on trying to help the parties do. Now they have to do it themselves, and as I said earlier, these are deep issues of history, and and quite sensitive issues, but encouraging the leaders to operate sensitively in recognition of that, to find ways to move towards appropriate reconciliation, to try to keep tension down, and to find ways to break the ice so that a dialogue can develop. I think is an important function for the United States to play, and we're a positive force there, frankly, on that. Absent that, where's the pushback? And where's the constructive voice? I think we should be a constructive voice in terms of looking to the big picture, if you will, in terms of Northeast Asian security, and also trying to keep in place the platform that we've had in place, as I said, for 6 decades, which has led to the rise of all 3 of those nations.
Okay, floor is open now for Abby Cohen.
Donilon, thank you so much for that interesting discussion, John. I'd like to touch on a point that you raised earlier, and that is that the Chinese, thank you, the point that you raised earlier about the Chinese importing food from Ukraine.
Yeah.
Clearly, the Chinese have reached throughout the globe for agricultural imports and, by implication, water, because of their own inadequate supply. Can you comment on this more broadly and give us a sense of whether this is a vulnerability for China? Does it give other nations leverage? And then, of course, the related question of whether the new government, which is looking towards economic reform, are they also looking towards a more sustainable economic model with regard to climate?
Yeah, well, I think on the latter, Abby, I think for sure, and you've seen announcements just in the last few days on that. They have big stakeholder issues, though, with respect to trying to move forward there. On the resource issue, this is a central challenge of the Chinese government, which is to provide the necessary core resources to continue their economic development, and it's really is the kind of the cause of our kind of in the world kind of bumping into China all over the world here, and their determined efforts to try to find appropriate supplies. I think it's most interesting in the next few years in the energy field, where just as the United States reliance on Middle East energy is the lines are crossing is going like this. Now, and the Chinese reliance on Middle East oil and energy is going like this, and I think that leads to some interesting discussions about energy sources, about the rules of the road, about Chinese interests, for example, in the Persian Gulf. I think they now have a deep interest in a stable Persian Gulf, given the energy needs that they have. They have a deep interest I think in pressing, for example, Iran to settle the nuclear file, conflagration in the Middle East, and the resulting increase in oil prices could be obviously very damaging to China. But I think this is an essential part of what they're up to as a government.
Alan.
Two questions about Syria. One, I appreciate your perspective and thoughts on how you might see Syria playing out over the next period of time. And secondly, now being out of office and looking back, what things do you think the U.S. could have done and realistically should have done over the past few years?
Yeah. On Syria, or generally?
On Syria. Well, no.
I know, long.
We do have a limited time,
Okay.
so just on Syria.
The Syria situation is tragic. I've been to Syria probably, 25 or 30 times in the course of my career. And it was and you've seen the history and tradition and culture of the place just devastated by the war. The war has multiple dimensions to it. It operates at different levels. Started out as a resistance to the Assad regime. It then developed into much more of a sectarian battle. It then evolved into a proxy battle between Shia and Sunni elements. And now you've got another dimension, obviously, which is I think from the United States perspective the most dangerous dimension, which is the battle within the Sunni opposition to Assad. I think with the most radical elements there fighting directly with the more moderate elements, frankly. So it's a complicated, obviously a complicated situation. and very dangerous. You have the flow of foreign fighters into Syria right now, I think, is at a greater rate than the flow of foreign fighters into Iraq at the worst points in Iraq in 2006 and 2007, and that's a real challenge for us going forward. I think that our approach obviously has been to try to push towards a diplomatic resolution. Those efforts have failed to date, and that would lead you to believe that this is going to go on for a while, frankly, and that and you could see but one scenario was kind of a cantonization or a fracturing of the state. You have the possibility of some of these most radical groups finding operational space in Syria, which would be a great concern to us and to other allies and partners. I think it calls on us to do a number of things. One is to continue to try to look for a political solution. Two is to provide assistance to the opposition and find better ways to do that. Three is to address the humanitarian situation, which we're the biggest donor of, but it continues to grow in all its dimensions. But there's no magic bullet here. Now a lot of discussion about U.S. military activity with respect to Syria, and I've not seen a military plan that I think is one that's workable, frankly, from the U.S. perspective. I mean, not every problem in the world has the United States military solution here, and this has been a kind of a situation where you have the combatants intertwined. There's no clear battle lines, and it just isn't. I don't see really kind of a clean military plan. I do think it's important to deal with these chemical weapons, and that's stalled a bit now. I think it's important to really try to succeed there. In Libya, for example, we looked at the threat that Gaddafi had against the citizens, particularly the oppositionists in eastern Libya, and you could see on a map what a military plan would look like, and we did have a lot of support from around the world. You had NATO putting it together. You had support from the Arab countries, and you had a military plan that was workable within a relevant time frame, and you could see it in front of you. There's not such a military plan, at least that I've seen, with respect to Syria. With respect to looking back, there'll be, I don't know that, frankly, that there was a military solution to this from the outset, frankly, in terms of looking back. Are there better, more effective ways to help the opposition? I think we should look at that and see if we're doing all that we can.
Ned.
How about the president saying Assad must go
Yeah.
a while back, and where do we stand today in terms of those negotiations and that precondition?
Well, I think at the end of the day, given everything that's happened, it's hard to imagine that you would have a political resolution in Syria where Assad was still leading the government. So I think as a practical matter, and I've made this point to the Russians a number of times, as a practical matter, you aren't going to have a political solution to the situation in Syria if Assad remains in Damascus as the head of the government. And particularly now, given the spectacular amount of blood and tragedy that blood that's been spilled and tragedy that's happened in Syria. Now how that happens in terms of a negotiation, what kind of time frames, what sequencing is kind of what you're asking about. I think that all should be up for negotiation among the parties. But I don't think we're even close to being able to get that kind of discussion going at this point. But I think that would be something you would talk about, which is what's the sequencing? How do you run an interim government? How do you get the next stage there? We went through this in the presentation we initially gave to the Russians, by the way, was based on our experience in Yemen, where you had an opposition group rise up against President Saleh. We entered into, working with the Saudis and others, did a series of negotiations where he agreed over time to phase out. We didn't take down the elements, kind of the institutions of the Yemen state. His vice president, Hadi, actually became the president and entered into arrangements with the opposition. That was the idea that we had in Syria, and the Russians would not buy it for a number of reasons. But they were in real. This was our prediction then, that in fact that you would have the most radical groups kind of take control of the fight is what happened.
Phil Knight.
I have difficulty believing the Chinese are taking their response to the Trans-Pacific Trade Pact quite as calmly as what I read your remarks to be. For a simplistic example, we're giving favorable duty rates to Vietnamese products compared to theirs. You're building up Vietnam at our expense. Are they not talking about retaliation or some kind of a more angry response than what you indicated?
I haven't, it's interesting. I haven't seen that. Have you? I haven't seen that, frankly.
Logically.
Yeah, but here's the deal. It is a substantial leadership move by the United States, and it's intended as such. It is intended as setting in place what a model set of trade relationships should look like, covering a range of issues from tariffs and non-tariff issues as well, to have a high standard, high quality agreement. It is going to involve 40% of GDP in a number of countries, and it's had a magnetic effect, obviously. It's interesting, when we started the discussions about TPP inside the administration, a number of us were pushing it pretty hard, and the main pushback was that it wasn't going to be significant enough, because initially it was only 6 or 7 countries. And a number of my economic brethren said, you're going to get us in these negotiations. They take a lot of time. Is it really worth the candle? And our prediction was, which turned out to be true, that it had a magnetic effect. That in fact, then you would have Canada, Mexico join, and ultimately Japan not joining, which has made it a very different trade negotiation in terms of obviously scale and importance in the world. But those are all the motivations behind it. It is kind of U.S. led. I think, by the way, actually, that they're making significant progress towards resolution on most of the issues. Now we have an issue here in our Trade Promotion Authority authorization, which is a domestic issue. But nonetheless, what it does is 2 things. The Chinese, I think, then do see that this, combined with the free trade agreement, which we're beginning negotiations are in Europe, see this really as the kind of the way the world is going. And it would, I think, cause discussion inside China as to adjustments that they're going to have to make if they're going to participate in what looks like an emerging trade regime in the world. And I think that they're just kind of confronted with that reality, and they can choose to make changes, right? And by the way, in China, there's John knows better than I do. There is some history of Chinese reform being driven by external factors like this, including, by the way, reforms in China being driven in a number of respects by their desire to be in the WTO. And I think in this case, it obviously provides, I think, Chinese reformers with some, with important facts to present to their leadership. Now, they may be a long way off from being able to meet the kind of standards that are going to be set in the TPP. But I think that's more the dynamic. It's a fact. We're doing it. We're leading it. It's probably going to happen. It's also going to be reflected in the European space. And these are going to be the rules of the road going forward. And there would have to be adjustments by the Chinese going forward, or at least recognition of that in their own practices. One would hope. Now, I'm sure that there are some elements in China, maybe a lot of elements in China, who look at this as overall, as I said, it's the economic element of the rebalance, and it provides more fodder for the argument that it's really about containment. But in the first instance, of course, it isn't about containment. It's about us pursuing our interests in kind of in a win-win way with our partners, and about U.S. leadership in terms of trying to put in place what we think is a high-quality, high-standard trade regime.
Next question. Let's see. Right here.
Hi. What did you think of Hillary Clinton's comments the other day comparing Putin's actions to Adolf Hitler's during the late 1930s?
Yeah, I haven't heard her whole set of remarks, so I don't really want to comment on something that I haven't really seen.
Well, she was basically saying that Putin's actions trying to help ethnic Russians in Crimea is similar to how Hitler helped Germans outside of Germany right as World War II started.
Okay. Well, I'd like to actually see her comments before I make a comment on it. I've not seen her comments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Other questions? Ken Lieberthal.
Are you grading my presentation? back there, Bader and Lieberthal are back there. You know, they've got a little yellow pad. You know, C+, B-.
Okay, I'll change the question I was going to ask. Seriously, Tom, you've stressed the importance of U.S. leadership on TPP.
Yeah.
And I think would give the administration very high marks for building it up and making it a much more important item. How concerned are you about the potential impact on the rebalance strategy and on the U.S. position in Asia if we successfully negotiate a TPP and then the president is unable to get the Congress to ratify it?
Well, I'd be very, very concerned about it, frankly. You know, you have nations, 11 partners or so in Asia making tough choices, including some that are going to be difficult domestically for each of the trading partners. And it's important that the United States, at the end of the day, be able to get it done. I think, as I said, I think it's very important for the United States' economic position. You know, we're looking for ways in which to try to add to our GDP around from every source that we can, and it's really important from a leadership position. And so I think that there are powerful arguments for it, and it's really essential that we get it done, Ken. I think that it would be a real blow, clearly, to U.S. global leadership for it not to get done. Indeed, I think it's the president's going to be in Tokyo on this trip in April. I suggest that there'd be a good opportunity to have the TPP partners at the head of state level meet there, frankly, with him, to talk about the way forward on the trade agreement. But I think it's a matter not just of a good economics, but it's a really key matter of U.S. leadership. You know, to go to the other issue about the Chinese reaction, the question that was asked earlier, which is a good question. This is all about, in some respects, the rebalance is really about trying to build an order, if you will, in Asia, or help to, that will allow the continuation of economic and social development and security and peace in Asia. And so these are all pieces that fit together, and it's the context for China's rise. And it just really is quite important that each of these elements get put in place, and the economic element is absolutely critical of this. This is, it's interesting, John, you asked what the Chinese talk about. You know, is this containment, is this all about security? And of course, it's very important in these conversations to point out that that's only one aspect of it. Maybe, and that there are multiple aspects, including economic aspects of it, which are win-win for the region. And so it's really critical that I think, Ken, that the United States gets this done, frankly, after engaging in this negotiation and exercising the leadership that we've exercised on it. I think it's important to get this done, and I think it's important also to get the trade, the Atlantic piece done as well. To have the United States sitting in the middle, of two of the most important trade negotiations in recent history, which will inure to our benefit and demonstrate U.S. leadership. It's the next stage of integration in Europe and the United States, and it's a really critical step for U.S. leadership in Asia. So you know where I come from on it.
Sure.
I was just wondering if you could shed some light on Afghanistan and what you think the strategy should be. Should we keep a residual force? Should we get out all the way? And what do you think happens over the next, whenever, let's say at the end of this year, next year, post the election, post at least drawing down forces? Do you think that the current government will survive or has the capacity to survive, obviously what is likely to be some kind of attempt by the Taliban to try and overthrow it?
Yeah, two or three things. Number one, the United States is on track to finish the current phase of its operations in Afghanistan, and we'll have the withdrawal complete by December 31st, 2014. Number two, these elections are really important, and I think that so far the reports are that they're on track to be pulled off. Third, then comes the question of a U.S. residual presence after December 31st, 2014. I would be for a small U.S. presence in Afghanistan, modest U.S. presence in Afghanistan after December 31st, 2014. That's not without controversy because it's expensive. But the mission would be quite narrow, and I think worth doing. One is to kind of continue, to continue train and assisting of the Afghan force that we built up. And there'll be an Afghan force of over 350,000 people. And I think in kind of continuing with our NATO allies and others to continue engagement, kind of the training and support for that force for a while longer, I think makes sense. And second, we have continuing counterterrorism, national counterterrorism concerns that can be best dealt with if we have a force inside Afghanistan. Now, these are not the only ways to do this, right? The United States has options. If in fact we can't sign on to a bilateral security agreement with Afghanistan. But my impression is that most of the current candidates for president in Afghanistan have said publicly that they favor an ongoing arrangement with the United States. Now that's important for a lot of other reasons, which I want to talk about for a second. If the United States isn't there, there are cascading effects. So the United States has a small force, let's say, of, I don't want to get into, I take it to some reporters here, so I don't want to talk about exact numbers, but it has a modest force. That modest force, if it's not there, means that you won't have Europeans and other NATO allies there because the United States provides essential enabling support, if you will. They won't, you can't, I just don't think at the end of the day that the Germans and the Italians and others are going to be present around Afghanistan if they don't have the support of the United States with respect to medical support and intelligence and lift and the kinds of kind of nitty-gritty stuff that you need to have a presence there, number one. Second, if the security forces leave, then the aid organizations are going to leave. And so, there was an extraordinary meeting, in Tokyo a couple of years ago where there was a commitment made to Afghanistan by the world to put quite a bit of money in Afghanistan over a number of years to support continued development. That's all at stake, frankly, which is why I think that President Karzai's posture on this has been reckless, frankly, because I think this is all good for the Afghan people going forward, and I think in U.S. interest as well. But I fear the cascading effects. If there's no U.S. security, there's no NATO security, they leave, then the aid organizations will have to lead, and then the non-security assistance programs will go away, and then you really do have I think stability issues there.
I'm going to take two more questions. Right here, Paul.
Yes, I guess the topic was rebalance in Asia, and we've been all over the world, so why not continue? Given the circumstances on what's happening in Venezuela today, is this an opportunity for us to rebalance our relationship with Latin America and review and re-engage Cuba and begin the process of rebalancing all of the losses that we've had in previous years with Ecuador and including Brazil, that is doing a lot of business with China, much more so than with the United States. So, is this an opportunity now, and what should we be doing?
Yes, I think it is, and that I think it's a really good point. The United States has the way I think about it, has a very good base, if you will, in the world now. If you look at from Canada, the United States, Mexico, and Latin America, in terms of its economic direction, in terms of its energy direction, we have a really good and solid base that we can operate from in the world. And so I do think it's important for us to look to deepen these ties, and I do think what you're seeing in Venezuela kind of points to that. If you look at the people here who do a lot more work on this than I do, but if you look at economic growth curves for the Venezuelans of the world, right? Versus the members, say, of the Pacific Alliance in Latin America, it's just a dramatically different story, and it's an opportunity for the United States, I think, to join with those countries that have been successful as models, and to, I think, take this opportunity to deepen our economic relationships, to look at some of the practical things that we can do in terms of economic relationships. I would look for a formal relationship with the Pacific Alliance, for example, going forward. The Vice President Biden, has been working on this as an important project of his, and I would encourage him to kind of stay on it. So I think there are opportunities, frankly.
Okay, final question. Right here.
Yes, thanks. A question related to your just passing comment on energy and linked to Ukraine. As part of this deal that was announced this week, it was suggested by some U.S. officials that the U.S. would help Ukraine reduce its dependence on Russian gas imports. I'd be interested in your views as to what that would look like in practice, and more broadly, are we entering a new era of U.S. energy diplomacy where the U.S. can use its newfound energy resources to help it advance its foreign policy objectives?
I think it's a really good question. I'd say the following things about it. One is that when the Obama administration came into office, we were told, for example, with respect to natural gas, that we would need to import twice as much as we were importing at that time, and we were given a lot of other predictions. Almost every one of these predictions turned out to be wrong. And indeed, the energy picture that we thought we were facing in 2007, 2008 has really been kind of flipped on its head. Number two is, everybody here, I think, knows the facts now that we're soon to be the largest producer of oil in the world, and we already are the largest producer of gas, natural gas in the world, and we're by far the cheapest natural gas in the world right now. Next, I think, third is that I think we're just beginning to understand the geopolitical aspects of this. There's been a lot of work done on the economic aspects of it. There's some debate about the scale of economic impact, but I think everybody agrees it's all to the good in terms of increased economic activity, lower costs for U.S. consumers, making manufacturing more efficient and effective in the United States, make us more of a magnet for manufacturing, particularly for gas-intensive industries. And that's all to the good for the U.S. Next, though, is on the diplomatic side, what are the impacts? And again, I think we're just wrestling with this. We've already seen some. And I think that they're two or threefold. Number one is it gives the United States more room for maneuver, first point. And the example of that, of course, is Iran. We've put in place these very intensive sanctions against Iran. And you can imagine the discussions we had when we were doing this, because the key sanctions were aimed at trying to reduce Iran's ability to sell its oil in the world. And indeed, we reduced it by half. Now, when we were having these discussions, of course, you would imagine we would ask ourselves, and again, my economic colleagues would come in and say, well, let's think about this. We're in an economic downturn, tight markets. What is the impact going to be on the United States? And we were able to do an analysis and go ahead with respect to those sanctions, which again reduced the Iranian exports by half because we had increased our own production by 1 million barrels a day. And it really did give us that maneuver to be able to go and do the Iranian sanctions. That's first. Second is I do think there are opportunities for the United States to assist its allies and partners around the world in terms of energy supply. We're already having an impact, right? I mean, to the extent that Qatar and other suppliers don't send gas to the United States, right? That's additional supply and diversification of supply for Europe and elsewhere in the world, and I think that's already having an impact. With respect to Europe specifically, that's a longer-term project, but I think one that's absolutely worth pursuing. As I said, we're already having an impact in terms of diversification and quantity of supply. And I do think, and we've gotten some approvals in the United States for export of natural gas. I'm obviously, you can tell, for that. And I think, and if you travel around the world, you'll see in Asia, Japan, India, and in Europe, allies and partners looking for additional supply from the United States, and I think we should look to doing that supply, frankly, going forward. In Europe, it will take a while because you have to build the facilities. You have to look at the cost, the differentials between pipeline-provided gas and gas that's shipped. And I think that Europe should also look at we should look at sharing technology with respect to fracking, and they can look to additional sources in Europe. I think. And over time, if you can globalize this gas market, you can break what is really tough in Europe, which is these contracts tied to oil prices, long-term contracts. And over time, those contracts will fall off. I think we can have additional supply, and the United States can play, I think, an important role in diversifying and helping our allies and friends around the world. I also think the United States, by the way, should look at lifting the ban on oil exports, given our level of production. So that's a long answer to your question, is that I think that, in fact, this is all positive for the United States, and it provides us with more diplomatic room for maneuver. In the case of Iran, for example, we're trying to put sanctions on, and I think it provides us with more opportunities to work with partners and friends around the world, including a country like Ukraine, but Europe generally, with respect to gas supplies over the long haul. And it is a real, that's a real circumstance for Gazprom and the Russian suppliers to have to confront, frankly. So I would do all of the above there, and I think it's all available to the United States, frankly. Now, it involves us having good regulatory regimes here so that we continue our shale gas process. It involves, obviously doing this in a sensible way. But I would look to accelerating it on the natural gas export side, and I would look to reconsideration of the oil import ban as a way for the United States to be a supplier and again, to work with allies and partners around the world more directly on these things.
Okay, I neglected, but when I introduced you earlier, to thank you for your contribution to the nation. And we thank you very, very much for this very interesting and clear and I think sensible and balanced discussion today. And thanks for your contributions.
Thanks,
Please.
everybody.